2001, a day that the world changed. Some of you will remember it. 5 Islamic jihadists or extremists took hold of 5 airplanes in the US. 3 of them were managed to be diverted, but 2 went into the trade towers. And what started to form from that day was a psyche in the West of a view of those that followed the faith of Islam. 2 weeks after that event, I was in Malaysia. Another pastor had opened up the door for me to be there. And the day we arrived was a day that all the Islamic states, so Malaysia is an Islamic state, the day that we arrived, the Islamic states of the Middle East had extended a little bit further into Malaysia, and they asked all Islamic states to declare jihad on the West, jihad being a holy war. That afternoon, I was scheduled to go for 4 days into the jungle with 40 Muslim students, as 2 of us were on mission there. And we had to make a decision in that moment, because the reality is, when we came back from the jungles, Malaysia, the Malaysian government would have made a decision as to whether they were going to join this call of jihad of the Islamic states, in which case, at best, I would be deported. At worst, you can figure it out. And it was in a small window of time. We literally had 2 hours before we were leaving to go to the jungle. I had to make that call. We had to make that call, what we were going to do. And in consulting God in that moment, we said fear will not be our decision maker. If we had felt called by God into this space, we believed that He would sustain us through it. 2 days later, I was in the jungles with this other pastor friend of mine and 40 Muslim students, and they would go off to pray. And so in the jungles, there would be mosques scattered around the place. And one of the most life-defining, life-transforming moments took place for me in that moment. I'm on the steps of the mosque, and 2 students had come out, and they started to ask questions about Jesus as they were wrestling their own faith. And that was a moment which has shaped and marked me as a person and what I would be prepared to say yes to for God. Not the only, but one of. In a moment of pressure where there were 100 reasons to come home, there was one reason to stay, to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, who said, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son." And so as I followed Jesus, would I be prepared to take Jesus' hands and allow love to triumph over fear? Love to triumph over all the discouragement and all the political wranglings of what was going to go on in that moment. That's the point of that story. Just by the way, the end of that story was that Malaysia decided not to join the Islamic extremist states. And we were safely able to continue our ministry for the next couple of weeks. But that day shaped me, sitting on the stairs with 2 Muslim students, because what I got to see was 2 humans searching for something of the meaning of life, not 2 Islamic extremists that the West started to shape politically. And so my eyes started to be shaped by something more pure and more loving than even if I had stayed at home. And so sometimes, even in the fear and courage of making a decision to do something which may have 100 reasons why not to do, I started to see more clearly. And so today, as we continue this Yes series, I'm talking to us and I'm wanting to invite us and I'm wanting to inspire us and I'm wanting to hopefully challenge us a little bit to say yes to an impactful life. Because here's the reality of the matter. Saying yes to Jesus, saying yes to His call, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to lead a fruitful and effective life. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So there's a guy called Thaddeus in the Bible. Heard of him? Okay. Most of you not. So actually he was one of the 12 disciples, believe it or not. In 2 of the Gospels, he was called Thaddeus, and in the Gospels, he was called Judas. But how's this? He was even referred to, excuse me, my voice is going, even referred to as Judas, not Iscariot. There were two Judases amongst the group, but he was known by, I'm not that guy. I would love to not be known like that. I would love to be known like Richard, the guy that did this, or Richard who believes this, or Richard who's moving in this direction, not Richard, not Iscariot. Thaddeus is never mentioned again in the scriptures. He's unknown. And so Jax did say, hey, Rich, listen, don't overdo it today, because just because he's not mentioned doesn't mean he was a guy that wasn't fruitful. And so I did ask in the first service, and I'll ask again, Thaddeus, he responded to the call of Jesus. He wasn't Iscariot, so he wasn't the guy that denied Jesus. So he's probably with Jesus right now. And so, Thaddeus, forgive me for what I'm about to say about you. But no record is mentioned of the impact that he had on people around him. But he was one of the 12 chosen guys. Then we have Mark and Luke. So you may know them as some of the gospel writers and the book of Acts written by Luke. And so Mark and Luke, we don't see had a direct call to follow Jesus. They weren't one of the 12. And yet they have had one of the most profound impacts of all of humanity in the last 2,000 years. And so my point is this, that saying yes to Jesus doesn't mean that you're going to live impactfully. And you don't require a position or a particular calling from Jesus to have effect on humanity and to leave a legacy on those around you. And so I'm going to encourage us not to be Thaddeus's or Judas, not Iscariot, but to be Mark and Luke's. That whether we have a call to a position or whether we don't have a call to a position, whether we have a call to Jesus' inner circle or we don't have a call to Jesus' inner circle, whether we've said yes to the big or yes to the small, whatever it may be, that we would say yes to an impactful life. That's what I want to call us into today. Many of us are living impactful lives, and I want to inspire us to keep doing that, to keep saying the big yeses in God. Some of us are not yet. And maybe we've allowed the 100 fears. Can I get some water? Might have had something to do with the Springboks yesterday. Thanks. For what I was saying. The call is to an impactful life. And will we say yes to that? And so, Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. And you may be asking me the question, Rich, why are we looking at an Old Testament scripture when we're saying yes to Jesus and this marriage proposal to Jesus, that Jesus becomes our spouse, that Jesus becomes our groom, and that's what we've said yes to. So we haven't just said yes to salvation, we've said yes to Jesus, our groom. That's our eternal reality, a marriage with Him and a partnership with Him. Why the Old Testament? Well, I want to say this, that Jesus came to fulfill what God's plan has always been, which is that as humanity, we would be in right relationship with God, we'd be in right relationship with one another, and we'd be in right relationship with creation, enjoying all that God has given to us. And so the story of the Old Testament leads us into the story of the New Testament, and it's one continuing story in God. So Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 to 8. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. I wonder how many of us can identify with that today. That we have slave drivers. We have a culture which is pushing us that we've got to earn a certain amount. We've got to work certain hours. We've got to culture, even some of our school system. And I know we've got some school teachers and many of you that are in this room that are in education. I'm so grateful for, and I know you're fighting against a system which just keeps pushing our kids even harder and further and longer. And we have this culture in this world that keeps wanting to cripple us. And we're not living lives of joy and spaciousness, but rather of oppression and compression and misery. And so this is the story of Israel in this day, but it's not dissimilar to our story today. And this is what God says, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. God's intention has always been this, that the people of God would be in relationship with Him, relationship with one another, relationship with the earth, and it would be good and spacious, flowing with milk and honey. Jeez, we need to pray that my voice gets to the end of this. 5 things, friends, that God's intention is for us. So this marriage proposal, this yes to Jesus is not just a yes to salvation. It's a yes to a life with Him, a partnership in stewarding and building a life that is good and spacious and flowing and milk and honey. So good and spacious. I think God mentions this for 2 reasons. You see, we can have good and small. And I think many times what we try to do is we try to live a small life because we can manage it and control it. But God's design is that we would have spacious, big, and good. And so it's good and spacious. Many of us can have spacious. Any of you that have been on farms will know that you can have spacious and it not be good. It's hard work. And so there's this good and spacious element to what God is inviting us into and what His design is. Come out of misery and into good and spacious. And then flowing. It means not stuck, not stagnant. How many of us, and I'm not going to ask you to show you by way of hands, but how many of us feel stuck or stagnant in some of the areas of our life? We feel like there's no breakthrough, there's no forward momentum. What is this, God? There's no progress. God came that we would have flowing. It would be moving. And with milk and honey, and we know that milk sustains us. It's good for, just at a very practical level, the calcium in our bones. And like when you're having a dinner party, a lavish dinner party, you don't put out milk because it's for sustenance. But it's not just sustenance that God's after. He's not just like work from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. just that you can sustain yourself. He's saying it's both milk and honey. There's sweetness to this. It's to be beautiful. But some people, I believe, end up living just sweetness. We only live in the excesses of life. And God is saying, no, I've seen the misery of those held in oppression, in captivity, by a way, a culture, what is being fed down to us, a system. And I've come to rescue you. I've come to take you by the hand to a good and spacious place flowing with milk and honey. That is the journey of God. And so when we say yes to Jesus, we're saying yes to joining His hand in that mission. Here's something of this scripture, which I think hopefully can open some of our eyes today. It says this, God says, I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians or the oppression, so if we equate it to today, and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land. You know the problem with today, friends, as a pastor, I see this. We have made decisions. We've said yes to things which have cramped us financially, which have cramped us emotionally, which have cramped us physically. And so when somebody dares draw on us because they're in oppression, we don't have any room to take them by the hand to lead them to a place flowing with milk and honey. All we do is say, I can point you in that direction. I'll point you, but I'm not going to take you. But saying yes to Jesus, yes to an impactful life, is that we would take His hand and that we would be able to take people with us, which means we've got to have financial margin. It means we've got to have emotional margin. It means we need to have physical margin, because how else can we take the hand of somebody who's now starting to fill that space? And so yes to Jesus, yes to impactful living, to effectiveness and fruitfulness, means that we've got to start saying no to some things as we say yes to Jesus. And so here's the reality. If I want to say yes, so I've chosen Jax as my marriage partner. So if I'm saying yes to Jackie, it means I'm saying no to a whole bunch of other things that were once upon a time good in my life. I had girl friends. Before Jackie, I say yes to Jackie. Those relationships have to change their nature. It is not a bad thing. It is a good thing. If I want to take Jax out for dinner, I've got to say no to going out with my mates to the pub in the middle of the week, because I've got to have some money and capacity and margin. And so if I'm saying yes to Jesus and impact, I've got to say no to some things so that I can actually, when somebody comes into my world, I can take them by the hand. I've seen your misery and depression, and I'm partnering with Jesus in this. And so I'm going to take your hand, and I'm going to take you on this journey. I would hope that all of us that are married, when we choose a marriage partner, our desire is to be with them and to do the things that they love doing. And so when we say yes to Jesus, we do the things that He loves doing. And what He's busy doing is leading people into a land flowing with milk and honey, which is good and spacious. And so if I'm going to be with Jesus, then I've got to free some room to be doing that too. Hopefully I've convinced you that it's worth living an impactful life. And so how do we do this? How do we do this? Two things. One's kind of saying no to stuff and one's saying yes to stuff. So we have to actively drive out some things. And so we're going to read from Numbers chapter 33. And where we are in the story is God has come down and He's rescued Israel. He's taken them by the hand. And He said, guys, I've brought you out of slavery. And I'm about to show you this good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey. But there's some things here that you need to know. There's some things that you need to do to make sure that you can maintain the good and spacious and milk and honey status of this land. And this is where we pick up the story. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they will give you trouble in the land where you will live. That does not sound very appealing to me. Barbs in my eyes. And so this is what it speaks of. This is what God is saying, is if we allow certain things to inhabit our worlds, not just our hearts and minds, but even our environments, it will prevent us from seeing clearly. Barbs in our eyes prevent us having good sight. And so what God is saying to the people here is, to Israel, is if you want to come on this journey with me into good and spacious, you've got to drive some inhabitants out. You've got to be careful what you watch. You've got to be careful who you hang out with. You've got to be set free from even some of the things your forefathers have taught you. 1 Peter 1 teaches us the empty way of life handed down by our forefathers. My parents sit here. I have had great parents who've loved Jesus and raised me in the best way possible. And there are still some things I need saving from the way that they thought. And there are things that my children need saving from the way I think. Because I'm not a perfect father. And my dad is an outstanding father, but he's not a perfect father. And so there's ways that we have that we need to keep finding the Father's voice in heaven from, to see clearly. Barbs need to be taken out. And so what are some of the inhabitants that are in our land that we need to remove? It says thorns in our side. I've never really had a thorn in my side, but I have had one in my foot. And it restricts our movement. We don't walk properly when we have thorns in our feet. So let's picture that in our side. You don't move properly. And so we wonder, God, you have for me good and spacious, flowing with milk and honey, but I'm limping along. Well, yeah, because you didn't drive out inhabitants as I told you to. You've left some things in your life. You've left some thorns in your side that is crippling your life. You've got some things to drive out. And then it talks about if you don't, then there's trouble in the land, our environment. See, the invitation of Jesus is to a marriage relationship, and we know the reason, we always celebrate marriage, but the reason that I highlighted it today, and so thanks Nix and Kerry for giving us, and Bram and John, for giving us this to celebrate, is marriage takes hard work. There are days where we don't feel like it, or it becomes too much, but we remain committed to it, and we get the beauty of an environment which is increasingly good and spacious, flowing with milk and honey. And that's what Jesus invited us to keep making that in our environment. But that means, so in my own personal marriage, I've got to drive out some stuff environmentally. And in different seasons of our life, we've had to drive out different things so that it remains good and spacious with milk and honey. And so it is with Jesus. That as we say yes to Him and we get to steward the earth and we get to create the environment, we want it good and spacious. And so just a question for us. If you want to understand, how are we doing in that? Maybe look at your last 5 phone calls. Maybe look at your last 5 movies or 5 series. Maybe look at your last 5 dinner invites. See who you're inviting into your world. And see if they go through the grid of, does this lead me to good and spacious milk and honey, or does this take me away from good and spacious milk and honey? It might just be a helpful tool for you to do a bit of assessment as we go, because we want to be helpful and constructive. So we also have to actively build. So we actively drive out, but we actively build. There's a Rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, who led the UK. He was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. And he writes a book called Lessons in Leadership. Very good, helpful to go and read it. And it's Lessons in Leadership coming from the first 5 books of the Bible. And he writes about Exodus. And it is really profound for me, so I'm bringing it to us today. He writes this, that Exodus, if it were to be summed up, the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible, and it's the story of Israel being set free from captivity and going into their promised land, which is a land good and spacious, flowing milk and honey. And he says this, the story of Exodus, if it's summed up in one sentence, would be the formation of a new people. The formation of a new people. That sounds very much like what Jesus wants to do with us. It's a formation of a new person. Formation of a new people. Okay, like God, I'm paying attention here. And Jonathan Sachs says this. He says it's quite interesting because there's 13 chapters in the book about the building of the tabernacle, which is like a temporary place of worship, a portable place of worship. And he says you'd expect to find that in Leviticus, like in the regulations of worship, but he finds it in Exodus. And so he makes this leadership lesson, which I think is so fascinating. For 27 chapters of the 40 chapters of Exodus, God is doing miracle after miracle. The 10 plagues on Egypt to set Israel free. I mean, he's turning rivers, the river Nile into blood. He's bringing locusts to devour the harvest. He's done miracles. Israel gets into the desert and they get a little bit moany around not having meat. So God says, okay, I've got you covered. I'll bring quail down at night. And they say, actually, in the morning, it would be really nice to have some baked bread. Okay, fine, we'll bring some manna down every morning. He says, actually, we're also a little bit thirsty. Okay, just tap this rock and some water will come out. Like God did miracle after miracle for 27 chapters of Exodus. And this is the learning that Jonathan Sachs pulls out. He says, all the miracles that God did not stop Israel groaning and complaining. And so his conclusion is this, miracles don't lead to maturity. And then he says the last 13 chapters was building of the tabernacle. And he says this, when the people were put to work, not once in the last 13 chapters is there any groaning or moaning. And so his lesson is this, when we do God's work, we will mature and grow, and we will find good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey. When we just trust and hanker after the miracles of God, it is not a recipe for maturity. And so, friends, I want to say this. When we come here on a Sunday, we are not that church. Do we desire miracles? 100%. Do we come here and are we pursuing the miracles of God? No. We're pursuing God himself. He may reveal himself through the miraculous and through healings, which he has done sitting in the front row here. We will see these things because that's God's kindness, because he loves us. And he'll take us by the hand, but that's not what we're after. We're not after feathers coming from the ceiling. We're not after oil coming from our hands. God may do all of that and bless us if he does that, but that's not our pursuit. Our pursuit is to worship him in holiness and truth. Our pursuit is to preach the word. Our pursuit is to do the things Jesus did, to get on and do the work, because then we're maturing. Then we're becoming a people. We're forming into a new people, which was always God's desire. That's who we are as a community. And so we need to actively build. I love building. Those of you that know me will know that I'm always either building at home or building on this property or other properties, or we're just always building. And I'm very grateful that I've managed to hand that gift or desire onto at least one of my boys, Sam, who can literally disappear for hours at a time to go and build something. And there was even one occasion, I think we lost him for about 3 days, just as he was building some robot that was literally like this high with a whole bunch of things. But here's the amazing thing. Not once did Sam come out in those 3 days and complain about being hungry. Not once did he come out and complain that it was too hot or it was too cold or it was this or it was that. He was so focused on building and accomplishing what he was trying to accomplish. And I think this is it, because we think of saying yes to Jesus and salvation matters. We forget what the salvation is for. The salvation is for an eternal marriage with him. That's what we prepared for. The bride, the Revelation talks about when Jesus returns, the bride is prepared and we will get to be with him for all eternity. And when we are we're building a life together that looks good and spacious, flowing with milk and honey. That's what we're doing. And so we've got to be on with the building. When we're hanging out with Jesus, he's building something. He's not just doing the miracles. He's doing the hard work of cultivating the ground around us, creating the environment, saying no to some stuff, saying yes to some stuff. That is what we are called to. We grumble when we are dissatisfied. And so if we think about why do we get dissatisfied, you may not have ever thought about it in this language, but I'm willing to bet that every one of your dissatisfactions would fit into one of these 5 categories, because we're created in the image of God, and this is what God created us for. You get dissatisfied because your life is not good. It's not spacious, it's not flowing, it's not sustainable, and it's not enjoyable. And so we get dissatisfied. Dissatisfaction should be a marker that we have said yes to some things in our life that is not saying yes to Jesus. So dissatisfaction should not be a cause for rebellion. Dissatisfaction should be a cause for us to go back to Jesus and say, I'm saying yes to you, which means I've got to drive out some inhabitants that have got into my land. I've got to drive out some inhabitants that have got into my heart and mind. I've got to drive out what I'm watching. I've got to drive out who I'm talking to or how I'm talking to. I've got to drive out how my friendship circles are shaped. I've got to drive out some things, and I've got to take hold of Jesus. I've got to say, yes, have I made room to take people with me on the journey? And so we've got to ask ourselves the question, so what about Jesus? I mean, we're a Jesus-following people, a Jesus-loving people. We've said yes to him. Our hands are in his hands as we walk along very romantically in love with him. What is he busy doing that we should be doing? Well, if we look at something of his life, we see that Jesus models this. So in his day, he was known as a teacher or a rabbi. And in those days, women were not allowed to be taught by rabbis. And so what does Jesus do? He says, okay, women, come. And so he has a whole bunch of women being taught by him. And then he does even something which I find quite hilarious. He says to all the men, okay, all y'all, you're not even going to fund this ministry, the women are. And so the women have the prestige of both funding the ministry and sitting with Jesus as a rabbi. And so what was Jesus doing in that moment? He was showing that in this world that he was busy living, it was not spacious for women. It was not good for women. So what does Jesus do? I'm going to take you by the hand and I'm going to make it good and spacious for you. And I'm going to demonstrate what it is to be fully human. I'm going to demonstrate what it is to be a son of God. I'm going to demonstrate what it is to create an environment that is good and spacious. Then what does he do? He goes and finds a Samaritan, someone who would be considered a foreigner, and as he engages in conversation, the Samaritan says to Jesus, hey, but you're a Jew, why are you talking to me? He said, well, because I've got room for you in my space, in my world. And so he starts to break the bridge of the foreigner, and he starts to make it like, oh, can I also have a spacious place in your world, Jesus, as a foreigner? Well, absolutely you can. And then we start to see this, that Jesus, a whole bunch of sick people and broken people and demonically oppressed people, they come to Jesus. And what does he do? He's not stagnant with his gift. He flows. And so people get healed. People get set free. And so Jesus is always about this thing of pulling people into good and spacious, pulling people into more land, pulling people into milk and honey, and flowing with his gift. He doesn't withhold anything. And so when we say yes to Jesus and to holding his hand as we walk on this journey of Christianity, this journey of our discipleship with him and our followership of him, it's saying yes to this, that will we include people in the story, not just point them because we haven't made room for any financial margin, or we haven't made room for emotional margin, or we haven't said room for physical margin, but that we would, I have seen your misery, and I have come down, and I've taken you by the hand, and I'm bringing you up into a spacious place. That's what it is to live an impactful life, friends. That we could help people understand something more of the kingdom of God. And so this is a Yes series. And I'm conscious that in this Yes series we've told some testimonies, but the purpose of the testimonies is to help inspire us, encourage us. It's never to say, hey, look at me, this is what we've done. But it's rather, how can we learn from one another? How can we shape one another? And so I will tell some stories now of what Jax and I have done, but the stories should continue outside. You should tell one another what the stories are over coffee. Like, what have you done to make a world more spacious and good for somebody? What have you done to unblock some things? What have you done to make it honey and sweet for people? What have you done? Like, let's keep telling the testimonies. Again, not to pat ourselves on the back, but to give God the glory of, hey, we can do this together. And so one of the ways that Jax and I have done this is that we made a decision that we would open our home to help people that have found themselves constricted for whatever reason. And so one of the ladies that we helped went through a physical abuse, and she felt unsafe. And so we pulled her into our home, and she was with us for 4 months, sitting around our dining room table, living with us. She felt protected. She got to see what a healthy relationship could be like. She got to see, because I don't know that we go 4 months without there being some disagreement, and so she got to see how can we go from when things aren't all rosy to navigating our way through to it being rosy. And so for 4 months she was with us. There was a guy who went through a divorce, and he lost everything. And he came and lived with us 6 months in our home, under our financial covering, sitting around our table, having dinner with us. Then there was a couple that went through an unbelievable trauma. They came into our home 9 months. All of this while we had children. I'm so conscious that our kids have paid a price. There is a cost that they have paid to help others walk into a good and spacious place. But it's part of the gospel that we've said yes to. Because actually the gospel that we've said yes to is that Jesus would first, as we take him by the hand, he takes us into our death and then into our resurrection. Because he himself did that same thing, not considering equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself. I've seen your misery, and I'm going to come into your misery, and I'm going to lead you out of oppression. I tell those stories, and I know that there are some of you thinking here, saying, Rich, that was not wise. You've probably got 10 reasons. I can tell you 100 reasons. I can double your reasons, triple your reasons of why we shouldn't have done what we did. What effect would it have on our children? 2 of them sitting here. What effect? But I can tell you one reason that dominated all. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And he's about the business of leading people into good and spacious when their worlds are not good and not spacious. And milk and honey when their worlds are not milk and honey. And flowing when their worlds are stuck. And so what will we do to open up whatever resources we have to be able to help others find a good and spacious place, or at least take a step towards it? It's radical, friends. It's radical, but the problem with the church in the West, and I know many of your stories, and many of your stories are radical, and I'm so appreciative of many of your stories. But generally, the church in the West has become a finger-pointing church. I'll point you to Jesus. I'll point you to Jesus. Don't ask anything of my resources. Don't ask anything of my physical time or energy. Don't ask anything of my emotional time or energy. I've got enough going on in my world. And so I'll point you to Jesus. Listen, that's better than nothing. But the invitation of Jesus is, will you live an impactful life, not just like Thaddeus, but like Mark and Luke? Will you be able to take people by the hand, and will you be able to lead them, bringing them with you into that space? So the invitation, the request, the push is, can we increase our view that we did not just say yes to salvation, We said yes to an eternity with Jesus. And if that is not your understanding of the yes that you said, then you need to do a little bit of understanding around that, and you need to shift. Maybe you haven't said yes fully to Jesus, because yes is to an eternity with Him as His bride, to building a life good and spacious, flowing with milk and honey. That's the yes. That's what He's about. And I want to spend time with Him. I want to spend time with my groom, and I want to spend time doing the things that He's doing, because I know that's the best place for me. It's the best place for us. And so what does that look like for you? Maybe your starting point is clearing your plate a little bit, driving out some things so there's a little bit of margin, physically, emotionally, financially, so that when someone comes knocking, you're not left with the only response of pointing them to Jesus, but you're saying, hey, come with me. I'm going to bring you into this land. Maybe you have that room on your plate, and your next step is being able to open up your space to somebody else, that they may enjoy the goodness and the spaciousness of what you have been able to create with Jesus. And so what does that look like for you? So I close out with, just because you've said yes to Jesus doesn't mean automatically that you've said yes to an effective life. And so would you say yes to an impactful life of bringing people along on the journey by holding their hands and pulling them into the world that Jesus is taking you into, good and spacious, flowing